What's going on, everyone? My name's Eric, and today on the channel we're going to be working on a guitar today, as I normally do on this channel. And what we're going to be doing is actually working on this guitar here. This guitar is actually like my classical guitar, and even though it's not really like a traditional classical guitar, like it has a preamp and everything like that, and there's a cutaway, and there's, it's made by Fender. This guitar is like a hybrid classical thing, and this guitar actually took me all the way through my university music degree. This is what I played pretty well every day when I was studying music in university. And honestly, this guitar doesn't really get a lot of playtime anymore because I'm not really playing a ton of classical guitar anymore, especially when I was using this every day to get at my university degree in music. And the other thing is that when I was using this guitar to teach guitar, like online or actually in-person lessons, this guitar was actually a little bit hard for students to kind of pick up on because, like most classical guitars, there's no inlays on it. And especially when you're referencing fret numbers and you're actually trying to point on the fingerboard to show where a student needs to be playing the particular part of music that they're learning, it's a little bit hard to do that on a guitar that actually doesn't have inlays and only has side dot inlays. So essentially with all that, this guitar kind of went by the wayside, and I've switched my teaching guitar out for something that's a little bit easier for students to kind of pick up on. But with all that being said, I wanted to kind of bring this guitar back to life and also give you like a bit of a buyer's guide when it comes to like acoustic guitars and classical guitars and things like that. And I also want to pass on my knowledge and some of these tips as well when you're maybe considering either a new or a used classical or acoustic guitar, especially because classical and acoustic guitars come with their own set of inherent issues that really don't show up on solid body electric guitars, which we're going to cover in today's video. So with all that being said, let's bring this guitar back to life. Alright, as you probably noticed with some of those close-up shots, there's just a ton of dust on the guitar, and that just comes from having the guitar sit for so long and not get played a bunch. I will say though that this guitar is actually in really good shape for having sat for so long, and that might not be the case for some other used acoustic or classical guitars that you might be considering on the used market, so keep that in mind. When you're considering a used acoustic or a classical guitar to add to your collection, you want to consider a few things, and especially when I was looking at this guitar here, I was really looking at the fingerboard and the frets, and especially around the body, and I'll talk about that in a second. The fingerboard on this guitar is actually in really good shape despite maybe not having an actual hydration. This guitar has no fingerboard cracks, really good. The frets are in really good shape as well, and there's no fret sprout or anything like that. Another really good thing to look at, especially if you're looking at a used acoustic or a classical guitar. I looked down the neck of the guitar as well. The neck is dead straight. This guitar actually kind of lives on a wall hanger for the most part, or it might actually go onto a guitar stand with neck support. All of those factors really help keep the neck straight as much as it can. And if you are going to leave your acoustic or your classical guitar out in the elements, make sure it's actually being supported like on a wall hanger or on a guitar stand that actually has neck support. Otherwise, the next best place to actually have a guitar is going to be in the case, where it's going to be away from all those elements that can actually affect the playability of it. Another thing too to consider when you're actually going to be buying an acoustic guitar or a classical guitar, you want to be looking right at the bridge, and especially that area there. You want to be looking to make sure that the bridge is not bulging, and that's a big topic because that's a very costly repair if the bridge is actually bulging, or if the back part on the acoustic guitar right behind the bridge is bulging up, kind of like an arch top electric guitar. I'm going to show some pictures on screen that really highlight bridge bulge and like the actual bridge lifting off the guitar. If your classical guitar, if your acoustic guitar has this, it's not the end of the world. It is kind of a costly repair, especially if the back and the actual top is bulging. If the bridge is just kind of lifting off, that's a real easy repair. I've done that a few times on certain acoustic guitars, and that's something I can cover in another video if I take an acoustic guitar and it actually has that issue, because that's a really good skill to have, and that can also save you a ton of money. And in case you don't know, those issues relating to the bridge actually lifting off the guitar or the actual top bulging is all related to the bracing and the levels of humidity in the actual room and in the environment that the guitar is stored in. Again, acoustic and classical guitars, they are finicky instruments. They are very temperamental because they are made of wood. There's a lot of exposed wood, especially with the whole internals of the acoustic guitar being pretty well hollow as well. So there's a lot of room for error in that sense, and a lot of room for other issues to kind of pop up. So always keep those things in mind, and if you are able to really control the humidity of your actual living space where the guitar is being stored in, try to do that as best as you can to kind of make sure there's a bit of like a happy medium in terms of humidity and moisture content in the air and all that. Otherwise, keep the guitar in the case and only take it out when you want to play it, and then you should pretty well avoid most issues that come up on acoustic guitars. Alright, so now let's get working on this classical guitar, and a lot of these steps are going to be similar to working on acoustic guitar. There's a few differences that I will outline as we go throughout the video. The first thing that you want to do when you actually take in your classical or your acoustic guitar, especially if it's used, you want to make sure you get all those old strings off. Now this part here is pretty specific to classical guitars here. This part, you can actually kind of see the nylon string is actually wrapped around itself, so it kind of locks it in place. So you want to think of this as almost like tying up your shoelaces, but you want to do the exact same thing for the string, just so the string holds. Classical guitar tuners are pretty different by comparison to traditional guitar tuners, so this is one of the things that you have to do to kind of compensate for having a classical guitar. You just got to tie the string around itself just so it locks in place. And I'll show that in a bit more detail as we restring the guitar. It's a pretty simple process that gets easier the more you do it, But if this is your first time doing it, I get how that might be a bit of a challenge. And the way that you're gonna get this string unlocked from itself is just kind of like a shoelace, as I made that comparison earlier. What we're gonna do is actually take the part that wraps around the string. We're just gonna pull it out just to kind of break that little lock that's in there. And then you just wanna slide that string out, and then we are good to go. And then you're gonna do that for the other strings on the guitar. Now, obviously the difference between changing strings on an acoustic versus a classical guitar is that the classical guitar, obviously the strings feed in from the back here. And on a traditional acoustic guitar, you have bridge pins that actually hold the strings into the body. On the acoustic guitar here, I have another video that's gonna go up that is gonna go over the do's and don'ts for actually changing acoustic guitar strings. So make sure you stay tuned for that, so then you can see specific tips for acoustic guitars as well. So now at this point here, I'm gonna be talking about the bridge bulge and anything that is related to that. As you can see here, I'm trying to get this as level as I can. The bridge is sitting very flat, which is awesome. There's no bulging behind the back of the bridge, which is awesome. So that tells me that the bracing is actually in good shape and this guitar has been pretty well cared for. So once again, make sure you are looking at this area of the guitar to make sure there is no bulging or the bridge is not lifting. And now if this is a used guitar that you're looking at and has some of those issues, you might want to walk away if you're not too inclined with working on guitars, or especially if you have not budgeted for bringing this guitar in to have a luthier work on it. Although if this part back here is bulging way too much and the bracing is pretty shot, some people actually take the whole top off the guitar, and that's an extremely expensive fix that can be avoided just by maintaining your guitar and storing it properly. Another thing that you can do to test to make sure the bridge is sitting flat, you can actually see if you can put any sort of paper under that as well, and it looks like I cannot do that, so that is another good test to do as well. Once again, let's take a look at the fingerboard. Since the strings are off, always a good way just to see if the wood is good, and it looks like the wood is good in this sense. As you can see, it's just a little bit worn out, but that is not the end of the world. So we're gonna clean all this up, we're gonna hydrate the fingerboard, we're gonna do the frets, and we're also gonna put a little bit of gear oil into the machine heads right here, because that is something you wanna do to make sure any moving part that is non-electrical is not seized on the guitar, so then they're actually working as they should be. Something else that I like to do on acoustic guitars, or just any guitar in general, I like to put a little bit of that 3-in-1 oil into the actual truss rod adjustment piece here, and that is another key element for buying a used guitar. You just wanna make sure that all the moving parts are gonna move as they should be, and everything that should not be moving is actually gonna be staying still. Alright, so another thing with working on any sort of acoustic or classical guitar, so if you're in a situation like this and the saddle actually falls out and you don't know which way it's supposed to go in, essentially what you could do is actually see the way that the bridge kind of tapers. So the side that sits lower is generally set for the higher treble strings on the acoustic or the classical guitar, and the side that gets a little bit bigger is to account for the bigger wound strings that are on the guitar as well. So even if you do restring it and you actually put the saddle on backwards, what you could do is simply just play the guitar, and if it feels weird, like maybe the treble strings are sitting higher than the bass strings, simply just loosen those strings, pull the actual saddle out, and just spin it around. And another thing too, speaking of action, if the string height is a little bit too high, what you can do is simply just take this bridge out and then get a file of some sort and run this bridge saddle back and forth on the file like that to actually take the overall height of the saddle down to actually make the guitar a little bit easier for you to play. And you can do that with a file or an actual like palm sander or something like that. Although if you are using a palm sander or some sort of electric sander, you do risk taking too much material off the bottom of this, which will then result in having the actual strings sit maybe a little bit too low. If you are in that situation, you can buy a new saddle and then start from ground zero again, or you can actually put a little bit of a guitar string. I recommend the E, B, or G string, the higher strings. You can throw that in here simply where the saddle sits, and then that will actually raise up the saddle, so then your strings are sitting just a little bit higher. All right, and at this point you're ready to actually restring your classical guitar. I like to use ball end strings just because they make my life way easier when I'm restringing classical guitars. And especially if you are the hobbyist classical guitar player or classical guitar owner and you need to change your strings, this is very similar to actually restringing like an electric guitar. So if you don't really care about having the traditional strings wrapped around the back part of the bridge here, then just use the ball end strings. They made my life way easier. And honestly, these are like $7 at the music store, so $7 for a lot of convenience is really hard to beat in my opinion. Something else that I like with these Martin classical guitar strings as well is that they actually give you a lot of detail on the string packaging itself. That might be a bit of a redundant thing for some players, but in my experience, especially like living with this guitar and using it on a daily basis and restringing it pretty frequently, I went through a lot of different string brands and a lot of string packs. A lot of them aren't like actually labeled like this with a lot of detail. Dealt with a lot of strings that have actually like not given a lot of this information, and they just have the strings all packaged together, and then it's kind of up to the individual to figure it all out themselves, which is not really intuitive for having an efficient string change. This is not sponsored by Martin or anything. Like I paid money for the strings and everything like that. But in my opinion, this is my go-to set, and I want to pass it on to you guys, especially if this is your first time living with a classical guitar and you're not sure really how to restring the classical guitar or which string goes where, because it sometimes is not clear from string manufacturer to string manufacturer. All right, so now let's get to stringing up the classical guitar here. So I have my classical guitar string here, and this is going to be the exact same for pretty well every string on this guitar here. What we're going to do is actually put the string into this little insert here. What I like to do is actually pull it all the way through and just kind of pull it tight. Very similar to what I would do on a locking tuner on an electric guitar. So then what I like to do is then bring some of that slack back, bring the string up through the top, then pull it back a little bit tight. I like to pull the string back. You then want to go and tie the string around itself, where it has like this bit of a loop on it, and that's gonna lock the string in place. Now this is what it looks like when it's all kind of done up like this. Now this is gonna essentially give you that locking string effect, because the string is kind of tied around itself like a shoelace when you're actually tying your shoes. And at this point, you essentially just kind of tune the guitar. And what I like to do as well when I'm restringing classical guitars, I like to hold the string back in both ways, just so there's the most amount of tension possible on the string, just so it's not going to slip in any way, shape, and form. Something else that I like to do with classical guitar strings when I am stringing up my guitar, I like to kind of hold the string really tight just so it feeds like really nicely onto these string posts right here. You do want to have the strings pretty in line, kind of like you're wrapping up a garden hose. So as you can see here, I'm getting this looking really tight and really nice. So as I'm restringing this classical guitar here, you're going to see on screen that the strings are actually kind of staggered away from each other. That's another thing that you're going to want when you are restringing your classical guitar. On an acoustic guitar, it doesn't really matter as much because the headstock design is inherently different than this, but you don't want to have any of these strings touching each other, because you do risk a little bit of tuning instability or strings vibrating when they actually shouldn't be. It might take a little bit of extra time when you are restringing, but it is going to be a game changer at the end of the day for overall tuning stability. Now coming back to an earlier point in the video with the bridge lifting or with the actual body of the acoustic guitar bulging. Now this guitar is under tension right now. We got it tuned up to E, and once again, there is no body bulging here. Especially if you're changing string gauges on your acoustic guitar, you're going from lighter to heavier. What you really want to make sure of is that there is no part down here by the body or the bridge that is actually bulging when you're adding more tension on the guitar. All right, and that's going to do it for today's video. Once again, a few things to look for if you are considering a used or brand new acoustic or classical guitar. Make sure you watch out for any sort of that bridge bulge or any of that body that is bulging up. If that is happening on your guitar, that's going to be a costly repair, or it might be a red flag to some people where they just don't want to deal with that guitar and they might want to walk away from it entirely. Totally fair as well. Make sure you are oiling all the parts on the guitar that need to be oiled, like the fingerboard. Put all that lubricating oil into those moving parts, such as the machine heads on there, just so they are not seizing, especially if your guitar is sitting over time. As you saw earlier in the video, as I was moving the Allen wrench back and forth just to kind of make sure the truss rod was moving and everything like that, and just to get some of that lubricating oil into the moving parts on that truss rod nut, just to make sure it actually works. And last but not least, if your acoustic or classical guitar is going to be sitting more than it's actually being played, the best place for it is the actual hard case that the guitar came with. But if you don't have a hard case, make sure it is on a guitar stand that is actually supporting the neck or the headstock, maybe such as a wall hanger. Anything to keep the neck straight, that's gonna really help with other issues going down the road. If you learned something new in today's video, make sure you leave it in the comments below. I love reading all of your comments and engaging with you all down there. If you like the video, make sure you give it a thumbs up. If you're new here, I have tons more videos that go over guitar maintenance tips and tricks as well. And if you really love what I do, make sure you hit the notification bell so you don't miss a single video that I upload. Thanks for checking this out, and I'll see you next time.